Be every kind of person and every kind of path. I actually think we're at a stage right now, the mandala era over, where we could have a lot of new things coming into the Baba scene. You know, we could have radically different approaches to Baba happening. Like, what if some of these musts came back? There ought to be a must prohibition rule at the Meherabad, because they would be wild men, you know. You can. What if they became Baba lovers? So I think we could have every kind of thing happening, and who's to say? So just hold on for yourself, and what other people do is really up to them. Of course, the center has to have its rules and its codes and all that sort of thing.
No musts allowed in Meherabad.
I think that would be a very wise provision. There was always the must, Ali Shah. I always remember, Ali Shah, one of the 5 favorites, who was very Jamali and very useful to Baba, and lived in Navanagar. Baba would call him in all sorts of occasions, and he was very distinguished looking must, and he had impressive bearing, and people who didn't know thought he was some sort of a great man of the world. But the downside to that was when he had to take a pee, he would just pull up and let fire, irrespective of who was there. So it's very, very humiliating for the mandala. He would completely blow it. And I heard that Muhammad the Musk, you remember him, he intensely disliked Ali Shah. They're both on the 5th plane. I think it was a one-way animosity. I never heard that Ali Shah reciprocated. But he would go and start backbiting Ali Shah, and he would criticize him on this very point that it was unsanitary. I mean, Muhammad the Musk complaining that someone was unsanitary is the most ridiculous thing I can imagine. I mean, I don't know, sort of like, a chimney sweeper complaining that someone's clothes were dirty or something,
He never used all those pieces of soap he used to pick up.
Well, maybe it was in preparation in case Ali Shah showed up again. Yeah, I mean, what if some of these guys showed up? We could have radical things happen. I do think so. And who knows, maybe musts will start to show up. Who knows what will happen over the course of time. Yeah.
Okay. The Babaji said something interesting. His last trip to Myrtle Beach, he said something about that the Meher Spiritual Center, that there would be, in the future, there would be cabins there. And he said that there would be cabins like for musts. And I thought, well, how could that be? Because there are no musts in the West. So unless somehow, over the course of evolution, it's going to change, and these advanced souls are going to be born in the West. It didn't make sense to me, but he did say something about that. There's going to be cabins built in Meher Spiritual Center.
I know there's a lot of talk about the Meher Spiritual Center, and I've heard different things about these different functions which could be fulfilled, but I don't know whether that's really true or not, whether Baba really said that. I think right now at the Meher Center, they're probably thinking about a lot of those things because they're, getting a new executive director, and I think they're thinking a lot more in terms of outreach and stuff like that. But there was, I think for the Biramangala Center, Baba had 5 divisions for the Universal Spiritual Center. A house for spiritually advanced souls, a spiritual academy, a couple of other things like that. I forget what they were. And there's been talk that Baba had said that for the Meher Center, but I don't know if he did. I'd like to know. Topic that I'd picked for this afternoon is growing out of some of the earlier discussion of the Tiffin Lectures. The last 2 sessions were taking a look at certain parts of it, little moments in it. But there's a more general question that I do think is important. It's right at the center of my work. I realize that not everyone here is by vocation, a textual scholar. There may be some non-textual scholars in attendance, and we wouldn't have spent all your time on this. But I do think this is a matter that Baba lovers is a lot of relevance to the Baba world, and that I have found that many Baba lovers actually do care about, and that is Baba's words and questions of the authenticity of Baba's words. And as I mentioned on the first day, and you may have noticed, Tiffin Lectures is attributed to Meher Baba's authorship. It's being published as a book of Meher Baba's words. And this is being done, of course, after he dropped his body. It's not a book that he ever approved. It's been edited, and the editorship was never checked over by him. So if there are people who would raise questions about, well, how is this being done and by what authority this is being done, those are very good questions, and they should be asked. And so, I know, I'm working at the Trust in this very department of things, and we've given a lot of thought to this. So I wanted to talk about that problem in general, and more particularly about the Tiffin Lectures, how it originates, because I think that the real custodian on these matters will ultimately be the community of Meher Baba's lovers. And I think that if any lover of Meher Baba's wants to say, if somebody says Baba said, and anyone wants to say, well, how do you know he said? Who said he said? That is always a valid question to ask. And no one should ever feel deterred from asking it. And just the fact that a book has been published, say, under the auspices of the Avatar Meher Baba Trust, does not make it a holy cow at all. The Tiffin Lectures opens with a statement by the chairman of the Trust, Shridhar Kelkar. You know Shridhar Kelkar. He was here, right?
Yes.
Last year? The year before? 2 years ago? On exactly this subject, and I'd like to read it out from the chairman of the Avatar Meher Baba P.P.C. Trust. So I'm going to read this. This is 2 or 3 pages. And again, feel free to chime in or ask questions or anything that you want to bring up. I mean, I really feel that it will be important for the community of Meher Baba's lovers to have a certain understanding of these questions, and for those so inclined to bring a critical awareness to it, and to be able to raise questions and challenges too. I think that's actually quite important, because I think it's quite possible that in the future we could have all kinds of fraudulence in this very department. You know, there's no guarantee that the words attributed to the Avatar are necessarily going to be his. One of Baba's mandali, well, Baba's mandali are not Baba. So, you know, we can have, I'll be giving examples, but like here's an example. You may have heard of Bailey, one of Baba's close disciples, Bailey, earliest disciples, knew him as a kid. I don't know how, I want to be a little bit respectful in how I say this, but Bailey was a person with many critics, should I put it that way, on matters of his honesty. He was widely disliked by many of the mandali. He went to jail on corruption charges. So you can see this is, you know, a person on the good to bad scale, had a lot on the bad side of things. One of Baba's mandali, okay? So when we get things from him, you know, I'm just giving this as an illustration that, you know, you need to assess who's saying this. Okay, let me give you another even clearer example. I'll come back to Bailey, but Paul Brunton, you may have heard of Paul Brunton, right? In Search of Secret India. And there's a whole chapter, or I think maybe 2 even, on Baba. So he gives an account of his meetings with Baba and quotes Baba saying a lot of sorts of things. So do we just take those quotes and quotation marks and say Meher Baba said, without taking into account who Paul Brunton was, and that there may have been an animus there, and all that kind of thing? I mean, obviously you need to take the source. But to go back to Bailey, he knew Baba in times where most of the people from those early years are, we have nothing from them. From the teens, 19-teens. And he wrote diaries and then lost them, unfortunately. And in the I think in the 60s, rewrote them from his memories. Okay. And at that time, he was very repentant of the life he had led. And it's full of that, talking. He really felt he had had a golden opportunity and had thrown it away. So there's a lot of personal backgrounds to this. Okay, so you have Bailey in 1962 writing about things that happened in 1916. That's 50 years before. So, if you're quoting things that he said, can you just take it as those literally are Meher Baba's words? Of course not. Bailey wouldn't have said so either. He was remembering from 50 years before. But it's important attestations to those periods too, when nobody else is telling us anything about that. So a lot of what we have of what Baba did, but what I'm focusing on, but what Baba said, comes to us through sources. And there has to be a critical awareness of these, not just to throw them away into the trash can, but let's suppose you have one of Baba's mandala, and he says, well, Baba said this, or you have a diary of what Baba said. Well, was the person there and wrote it down at the time? Or was the person there and wrote it down that night? Or was the person there and wrote it down 15 years afterwards? Or was the person not there and heard it from somebody else and wrote it down? All these sorts of things. And they do matter. And it's not for, I was joking about not everybody being a textual scholar. It's not everybody's work to go into all of this. But I do think that a lot of Baba's lovers can understand what I'm talking about and do care. In other words, I'm reading this as being attributed to Meher Baba. Well, did he really say it? That's a question that a lot of people would care about. And so I think we're in a time where there needs to be more of an awareness of these things. And I also am a strong believer that when books are published, they need to be straight about this. And also they need to be a bit more careful in this era that we're going into than... I'm not faulting anyone in the past. I'm honestly and really truly not. But we do need to have presentations of Baba's words that are cognizant of all of this. Yeah.
I'll just make one more comment on this, that I think is a really interesting and important topic. It's got many levels. But along the lines of what you're saying, someone wouldn't necessarily have to have, if we were talking about Paul Brunson, an animus or have ill will and negative intention. Well, what the field of psychology knows, for instance, about memory, we know that memory is very, very unreliable. So if you're asking even somebody who would be considered to be a really good source, like one of the mandala, and you're asking them 50 or 60 years after the fact, even with best of intentions, the field of psychology has proven that that memory is very, very unreliable. So without underlining that, there's the opportunity to have things set in stone for posterity that are quite possibly inaccurate.
Yeah. So like even I would say Erich Jeswala. I couldn't think of a better source than that. But I remember many times when he would tell things, and there are inaccuracies there. I remember one time where he was telling a story, and this was earlier on. Later on, he wouldn't have done this, I don't think. But he said he was going to tell a story about a perfect master. They said, no, let's call Baba, because after all of these perfect masters are Baba. And he told a story that was not about Baba. It's a story in the discourses about a perfect master with his disciples. And Erich knew that, but he was making it alive for those of us who were there. He wasn't deceiving anybody. He was, what Erich was doing? He was working with the kids who are, a lot of us are kids, new to Baba, trying to give us a feeling for who Baba was. So he told that story as though the master in question was Baba, when it was not. Okay, so somebody might see that tape and think, well, Baba said that, but he didn't. Now, you can't do better than Erich. And there's a case not of a memory failure, but of his work with those of us who were there.
A little embellishment.
Yeah, embellishments. He would do that all the time. He would tell a story, and then he would spin it out with dialogue about Baba said this and Baba said that. And certainly by later, I think even early in my opinion, it's not that Baba necessarily said that. He was giving a feeling for how Baba dealt with people. And it was wonderful. I mean, we would have a tremendous, tremendous loss not to have that. But you can't take it as though necessarily Baba literally said that. Would you agree with all this, John?
Yes and no. I mean, having made hundreds of hours of recordings of marriages and listening to them, and there were various embellishments and stories, especially in the latter years. You'd say, I don't remember some of the details exactly, as he'd preface it with that.
Yeah.
But when he would quote things that Baba was saying, the words would sometimes be a little different, but the meaning basically seemed to always be there. I'm sure there are some cases where it wasn't, but
yeah. You know, I would don't want to miss.
Great consistency,
Yeah.
I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And he seemed to be very particular about facts and honest.
He would always say, you know, about dates and facts, don't go to Balda too, you can't trust me. But I did find too that he was actually very good.
Yeah.
But not everybody was as attentive to that as he was.
No.
And so all of this needs to be, you know, taken into account.
But that's why the Chanji's notes are even more significant, because his only intention was to, you know, accurately record without personal, you know, his intention was to accurate, so that makes it more significant.
Yes, and that's why it matters a lot what the source is. In this case, the source is Chanji. And again, you can't do better than that as a source. Chanji had certain mistakes he would make. He would sometimes mix up the dates, for example. I found that out. Not badly, but a little bit. So you learn the characteristics of the person in question. And all of this needs to be studied, in fact. But when Paul Brunton says something, like Paul Brunton neglected to mention in his book, for example, I don't know, if you haven't read the book, it wouldn't mean as much to you, but it's very derogatory about Baba. And we visited Baba, I think, in 1930. But it turns out that Paul Brunton was actually hosted throughout his entire trip into India, seeing all these masters and gurus, by Baba's own people. And he never even mentions that, you know. It's a very misleading impression he gives. So now that isn't a source that I would trust. So all of this is going to become more important now. So here's what Shridhar has to say, introducing this book as a book of Meher Baba's words, but as determined by the Avatar Meher Baba Trust, and we'll come to why the trust would be in a position to make such a determination. He talks about that. The Avatar Meher Baba Perpetual Public Charitable Trust is pleased to bring before the public this new collection of the early discourses of Avatar Meher Baba. Based on the diary notes and subsequent write-ups and drafts of Framrose Dada Chanji, Meher Baba's intimate disciple and personal secretary, Tiffin Lectures presents an edited text of the lectures that Meher Baba gave in 1926-27 as part of the education and spiritual training of his Nin Mandali during this foundational period of his avataric mission. In their substantial content, the discourses in this book are undoubtedly Meher Baba's. Chanji, as he was called, served throughout the 2 decades of his discipleship as Meher Baba's leading diarist and scribe, and his labors on the Tiffin Lecture manuscripts that he produced must have gone forward with Meher Baba's knowledge and approval. Accordingly, Meher Baba has been designated as the author of this book. This determination comports with standard practice in the literary world, where the title of author is customarily accorded to those individuals who are the creators of original creative content, even when others may have recorded it and written it up in some fashion. You know, the treatises of Aristotle are widely felt now to have been notes on lectures that he gave, possibly notes written down by other people, not his written compositions at all. And yet no one challenges the attribution of authorship to Aristotle. And there are lots of examples of it. And what I'm saying, this is kind of standard practice on determinations of authorship. At the same time, it must be recognized that Meher Baba himself never had this Tiffin Lectures material published during his physical lifetime. Since the words of the Avatar of the Age exercised great influence on the lives of countless individuals and even mighty civilizations, it behooves those bearing responsibility for his words' safekeeping to exercise caution in authenticating the words and messages in books which are presented to the world as his. Avatar Meher Baba himself assigned the primary responsibility with respect to his literary legacy to the Avatar Meher Baba Trust, an organization he created in 1959. This assignment was accomplished by instrument of his last will and testament. Did you know that there was such a thing? Yeah, in fact there is. Executed by him on 17th June 1967. In the fourth clause of this document, Meher Baba writes, "Accepting such copyrights as may have been transferred by me during my physical lifetime, I own copyrights in all my literary works, direct and indirect, published and unpublished, including my sayings, poems, messages, articles, discourses, books, charts, maps, etc., as well as copyrights already gifted to me and those that may be gifted to me in future by other writers who love me." So now what copyright is the right that comes by virtue of authorship. If I am the author under the Berne Convention, which is the standard copyright convention accepted by almost all countries in the world now, if I am the author of a work, by virtue of that authorship, I acquire the copyright. So copyright means authorship. So Meher Baba is, I own copyrights in all my literary works. And here's another thing I'd point out about this. Direct and indirect, published and unpublished, right? Unpublished, well, that's obvious. And direct and indirect, well, what could that possibly mean except, presumably when Baba wrote this, he intended to communicate something intelligible to the people who would read it, right? So indirect would have to mean discourses he gave that were taken down by somebody else, right? I mean, it makes sense to me. It's an indirect transmission through somebody else's record. So he's claiming the copyright in those discourses that descend in that way too. Does anybody want to challenge that or question that? Because that covers Tiffin Lectures. And that would be indirect transmission of a discourse of Meher Baba's because it was taken down by Chanji.
Now, when do we get into public domain? That's a very interesting question.
Yeah.
What was the question?
When does it go into public domain?
It used to be 28 years and 28 years more.
Yeah, no, it's different now. It's the life of the author plus 70 years.
Plus 70.
Yeah. So that would run until 2039. And there are various, and there are other complicating things about that, but basically it's 70 years from the death of the author right now. It's national law, so It could vary from one country to another. I think India was 60, but maybe they've changed to 70, I'm not sure.
Well, once something is published, it will never become public.
No, it will become, it falls into the public domain. Now, in the case of a work like this, the edited text, I mean, the editors, myself and Merwan, can claim copyright on that work, and we're both giving it to the trust. So that text would be 70 years from my death, as a matter of fact. So, I mean, but you could go back to the original sources of it, which are not covered by that. So copyright law gets very complicated. But basically with Meher Baba's literary works, we're talking about 70 years from 1969 is the basic date. Also, here's another thing. Notice that so Baba is claiming ownership. You see, you might say the avatar of the age would say, my messages are for all humanity, no one can own them, right? You might think he would have done that. He didn't. He didn't. He said he had the copyright and he made provision for their assignment to the Avatar Meher Baba Trust. And the way he describes these, you notice he's not saying published and unpublished, including God Speaks, Discourses, Life at its Best, The Everything and the Nothing. He could have given us a list of titles. He didn't. He gave us a list of literary genres, types of works. In other words, everything of his authorship he's claiming the copyright to. Even charts, maps, books, article, everything,
I'll tell you another secret about this. The original is the first copy, because the real work is spiritual. It's actually within the imagination. So it's beautiful the way this is written. Good lawyer, because it's expressed as relevant as possible.
Yeah.
Actually, enjoyable to see it on this one. And especially with the subject of the film.
Yes.
If I may say another thing,
Speak a little louder, it's a little hard to hear you.
if I may say one other thing, there's a famous saying of all of the wonderful poets, which I always misquote, words are really the skin of the living thought. And we're in a particularly interesting and difficult situation in this, because a lot of the words, marriage might be remembered and quoting words that actually came from marriage's mouth, not from mom, yet interpreted. So the essential idea that we're trying to express Baba's thoughts, and that we're being objective and simultaneous, that's the word, the psychologist, objective about our subject. Is all we can do, because we're just people trying to do this, and Larry has a memory as words this way. That's the only hope we have. History tells us that this is screwed up over and over.
Yeah, I know. These questions are going to come up more and more because they're linked in the case of our particular author, especially Baba's silence. He was silent, for heaven's sakes. He didn't say anything. And he didn't write anything except the book, which when the LA Center finally decides to let it out, we can read. Lois.
I told you to not put it behind that screen back there.
Oh.
Check the cupboards in the library.
In clause 6, Meher Baba continues, I hereby grant, bequeath, and assign unto the said trustees of the said Avatar Meher Baba Trust all the copyrights, with the exception of those previously assigned elsewhere. He had given some of them to Sufism reoriented, to have and to hold, subject to the conditions and provisions of the trust, whose deed Meher Baba had signed 8 years earlier. Clearly the category, this is Shridhar again, clearly the category of my literary works, as Meher Baba defines it here, would include the core text contained in the manuscripts known as the Tiffin Lectures. These discourses can be described under the language of Meher Baba's will as unpublished and indirect, Remember, published and unpublished, direct and indirect. Those are what he said. Since they come to us by medium of Chandri's diaries. Yet while acknowledging Meher Baba's authorship, the Avatar Meher Baba P.P.C. Trust feels it necessary to differentiate between those literary works that Meher Baba actually had published during his own lifetime, with his evident knowledge and approval, and with his name on them as author. So those are the three criteria. Published during his lifetime, with his evident knowledge and approval, and with his name on them as author. That's one category of things where he himself put his stamp on it, you might say. From those which he did not. For in the case of what we could call his published words, Meher Baba personally oversaw the selection of the literary material for release to the public, the editorship, and the publication process. These published literary works bear his personal authorial seal. Words unpublished during his physical lifetime, however, do not bring with them this assurance. Their selection, editing, design, and publication has been accomplished by persons who, while acting in all sincerity in Meher Baba's cause, are subject to the ordinary human limitations that afflict all but the perfect ones, and who may therefore have inadvertently rendered his discourse in a way that he would not wish. Is this all making sense? No. Accordingly, the Avatar Meher Baba P.P.C. Trust has adopted different editorial policies with respect to Meher Baba's published and unpublished words. The text of Meher Baba's published words, as the Trust has determined, may not be altered. These are the things that he got published and oversaw the editing of. They may not be altered except in non-essential details, such as in the correction of errors of spelling and pronoun-referent agreement, in the normalization of punctuation and capitalization, and in other small points in the mechanics of writing. The text of Meher Baba's unpublished words, on the other hand, may be edited more fully, in the manner and according to the principles that he himself laid down during his lifetime, and its presentation accomplished with the aid of creative design, in the redrawing of charts, supplementation of text with visual materials, and so forth. But the Avatar Meher Baba P.P.C. Trust emphasizes that such editorial and design work does not and can never bear the seal of Meher Baba's own personal approval, and accordingly, such work remains perennially susceptible to critique and revision. In the case of Meher Baba's unpublished words, the authoritative texts are and perennially will remain the source records from which such editions are compiled. Such records should always continue to be made available to the public through appropriate channels. And when it is deemed necessary by those vested with the appropriate authority, qualified persons charged with this task can always return to these primary records, and on that basis create new editions that are more authentic and faithful and truly expressive of Meher Baba's own original personal communications on which the primary records themselves are based. As an edited text of Meher Baba's unpublished words, transmitted indirectly by medium of his intimate disciple and secretary Chanji, Tiffin Lectures is subject to these constraints and provisions. At the same time, the Avatar Meher Baba P.P.C. Trust has reviewed its content carefully and presents this book to the public with confidence that it does indeed render Meher Baba's words in a reliable form. These lectures constitute a priceless jewel, a priceless treasure, a crown jewel in the inheritance that the Avatar has bequeathed to humanity, and they will continue to illuminate many inner spaces and guide many seekers on the journey to his feet. That's Shridhar Kelkar, last Silence Day. So this is the policy that the Trust is pursuing Does this make sense to everybody? So things that Baba himself had published during his own lifetime basically remain unchanged, except for like spelling mistakes or mechanical errors on that order. Things that he never did have published do get edited because they have to get edited. They're just not fit for publication in their raw form, but edited according to, as best we can ascertain, the way that he wanted them to be edited. I'll look at some of the criteria there. And any edited version should be presented as such, with all the original sources made available to the public. The whole thing is open to critique, and if in the course of time it's felt that a new edition is needed, the authoritative texts are not the printed edited version, but it's the source records. That's the authoritative text, you might say, and it can be gone to, and new editions can be come out with.
So, was that done with the discourses? Because I feel like there were changes in the discourses, like in the pronouns, like they weren't going with the King's English, which was proper back then, and they decided to make these changes so that it wasn't always he and him. But it bothered me that they did that, because maybe Baba dictated the discourse.
This is the 7th edition you're talking about. I think you are.
What I'm complaining about is that.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
We got a one book.
From the 3-volume set to the 1-volume 7th edition. Yeah. Oh, I'll come to that in a minute. I'm going to get to some of these things. Yeah, that's kind of an exceptional case. And there have been controversies on these matters, as some of you may know, and it's reasonable enough that there should be. So I'm going to take a step back, just to bring into the purview here the broader cultural resonances associated with this. We're talking, with Baba's words, about the most important category of literature that there could be, actually. I mean, we're talking about the Koran, the Gospels, the Bhagavad Gita is attributed to Krishna, the Buddhist sutras, and these scriptures have exercised incalculable impact on humanity. They have outlived civilization after civilization. I mean, look at the Gospels. They arose under the Roman Empire when the Christians were being very persecuted, according to traditional stories. It became accepted in the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire collapsed. And this is in Western Europe. The Germanic tribesmen swept in. They became Christianized. We had a 1,500 years of post-Roman history, and the Gospels continued throughout all of this. Look at the Koran. Look at all the history, the wars, the caliphates, the collapses of dynasties that have happened within Islam. And yet, the Koran is still there. So these literary expressions of the words of the Avatar, or the Quran, the words of Allah, as it is regarded within Islam, you might think that words are a very fragile thing. These words have proved mightier than one civilization after another, and they have endured throughout it all. And they have a way of working themselves into the minds and the thoughts of billions of people. Some of the key phrases and understandings by means of which people construe reality. Think of their place in the universe. Who am I? I'm a slave of God, let's say. Well, that's part of a construction given by an avataric advent, and the language of these primary texts have much to do with the way people think about these things. So that's the category of literature we're talking about when we're talking about God Speaks in these books. So they're really, they're massively impactful. You might think somebody like Shakespeare is important. These are flashes in the pan compared to the words of the Avatar. So this is really something that does matter.